In chapter 1002, Onigashima loses a horn to Zoro after he cuts it in one shot. What is so interesting about this is that while the feat is very impressive, it's so impressive that Big Mom actually tells Kaido to dodge the attack, which means it would have done major damage to Kaido if it connected. What's so interesting about this too is that you can see this as foreshadowing to what actually happens upon Kaido's defeat in chapter 1049, because after Luffy awakens and uses the Balrang gun against Kaido, he too loses a horn, one of his real horns, not the dragon horn, the curved horns on the side of his head. So it's funny that he loses a horn from this attack, where his island now at the end of the arc has lost both of his horns, basically. What's so funny about this further is that based on the contextualization that we get earlier on in the arc, the island Onigashima wasn't always called Onigashima, which means the island itself has more lore to it than we know, which could also mean that the skull is a real skull of a giant from long ago, which makes sense based on the contextualization we keep getting about giants throughout the story of One Piece. It's also funny that the horns of Onigashima and Kaido's horns have the same shape. But also, spoilers for Elbaf, there are going to be a few peppered throughout the video. So anyway, continuing. This starts in Thriller Bark with oars, and we get even more contextualization about in Elbaf because giants tend to have horns in Elbaf because of the ancient giant's blood running through their veins. So that in itself is quite an interesting factor. So I find it quite funny that we get a foreshadowing to Kaido losing his horn, and then it actually happens upon his defeat. But continuing off of that, what's quite interesting is that what if, based on several characters having a good and bad timeline in various SBS entries, what if Kaido's daughter, Yamato, loses a horn in the bad timeline, but in the good timeline, her horns keep growing to the point where she looks like a longhorn steer and she can't get through doorways. Kind of like Patrick in that one SpongeBob episode when he had the board nailed to his head. And I think that's quite funny. But you should nail that like button, then nail that subscribe button. And if you can find it, please nail that hype button. It is very much appreciated. But what I'm getting to is that I think looking at Onigashima and seeing as how Kaido suffers the same fate as the skull of Onigashima, presumably this could be even more evidence that ogres, or onis as Kaido describes them to be, are distant cousins or some sort of relative to ancient giants. Because based on what we're getting in Elbaf, they're still around to a great degree as giants such as Loki and Herald, and also spoilers for Elbaf. But you look at Loki and Herald, and seeing as how Estrid is more or less the same way, as she too has ancient giant's blood, they're still around and they're still quite massive. And even looking at the Herald flashback and how he met his first lover, Ida, the mother of Haruden, and how she's wearing horns as well, it seems to be a well-known fact that giants have horns. Even when you look at giants that aren't particularly from Elbaf, because when Ida was performing in the circus, she somehow knew to wear horns to look more intimidating. Where did she get that information? Something to think about. So I say that to say, it's quite funny that the two are this connected and have been connected throughout the entirety of the story, even way back in Thriller Bark, because it's very likely that Moria, who is very much related to Kaido, also has horns, and he introduces us to Oars, which is the first ancient giant in the series. So the parallels are very uncanny, and they keep happening throughout the story of One Piece. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede. What?